At the beginning of the 10th century, with the backdrop of the Abbasid decay of authority, a state arose in Ifriqiya on the hinterlands of the Khilafah. With its roots in a movement that had been driven underground, the creators of this new Shia state had been moulded by the pressure of living in deserts and in secret. Once in power, they announced their ambitions by establishing a Khilafah. From its humble origins in Ifriqiya, it rapidly expanded across North Africa and the Middle East, in the process overshadowing their Abbasid foes. From 1021 onwards, however, the Khilafah went through a slow but sure decline. Whilst its far-flung territories started to lose touch with Cairo, the Khilafah encountered enormous social and economic problems at home in Egypt. Nonetheless, the Fatimid state trudged along and braved the numerous foes and issues it faced, in the process leaving an indelible mark on Egypt and the territories it ruled. This is the history of the Fatimids. In the first few centuries after the initial spread of Islam, the newly won territories were subsumed within a single political entity, referred to as the Caliphate or Khilafah. First there was the Rashidun, next there was the Umayyad, and then it was the Abbasid. This political homogeneity belied the diversity of visions within early Islam. The most obvious point of division was between the Sunni and Shia sects. Put simply, Sunni Islam places its emphasis on the Sunnah, or the teaching/actions of the Prophet Muhammad, as well as accepting the legitimacy of the first three Rashidun Caliphs, who were elected through a shura, or council. Shia Islam, on the other hand, has a special reverence for the Ahl al-Bayt, or the family of the Prophet Muhammad, who they believe to possess special spiritual and political authority. Therefore, to Shias, the Imam or the person in charge of the Ummah, aka the Muslim community, should be from the family of the Prophet. This is why they believe Ali, the Prophet's cousin and the fourth Rashidun Khalif, should have been the political successor of Prophet Muhammad, and thereby the first Rashidun Khalif. Now, there are plenty of divergences within Shia Islam as well, with various subsects cropping up throughout the centuries. One of these Shia subsects will be the protagonists of our story, because you see, the Fatimids were Ismaili Shias who claimed descent from Fatima, the daughter of the Prophet Muhammad, through Ismail, a member of the same lineage. Roughly around the turn of the 9th century, the Ismaili Imams went into hiding as a result of repression from the Abbasid authorities. So they established themselves in Salamiya, a city on the edge of the Syrian desert, and set up a secret network of missionaries who would do dawah, or proselytize, and spread the Ismaili creed. These missionaries, known as Da'is, gained influence throughout the Islamic world, especially in places like the Maghreb, Bahrain, India, Yemen, and Persia. At the start of the 10th century, Abbasid authorities became aware of Ismaili activity in Salamiya. So the 11th Ismaili leader or Imam, al-Mahdi, who would go on to become the first Fatimid Khalif, left Syria for Egypt in around 902 AD, disguised as a merchant. But the Abbasids' re-establishment of authority over Syria and Egypt meant that al-Mahdi had to move again. Thanks to the work of his missionaries, he had various options. He settled on the Maghreb, far from the Abbasid threat. There, one of his missionaries, al-Shia, was making major progress spreading the Ismaili doctrine throughout Ifriqiya, a territory that encompassed eastern Algeria, Tunisia, and western Libya. That progress was dependent upon the Kutama tribe of Berbers, who essentially formed the Fatimid army at that point. By 906, al-Mahdi had settled in Sijil Masa, a city on the edge of the Sahara Desert in Morocco. There, he bided his time, waiting for the signal from his loyal missionary al-Shia in Ifriqiya. In 909, the mission was complete. The Aghlabids of Ifriqiya had been ousted, and al-Mahdi could now take his rightful place as the Caliph. One of the first things the newly established Fatimid Caliph did was virtually identical to what their Abbasid foes did when they themselves got established. The same way that Abu Muslim Khurasani, the man who spearheaded the Abbasid acquisition of power, was executed soon after elevating his masters, al-Shia, the Ismaili missionary, was executed in 911, with the Caliph accusing him of treason. Al-Mahdi's reign started tumultuously when certain groups amongst the Berbers rebelled against his authority. But the Caliph was up to the task. Through tribal intrigues, he managed to quell the insurrection within a few years. Shifting focus onto foreign policy, the coastal nature of Fatimid territories, as well as the fact that they had inherited the island of Sicily, brought them into conflict with another major Mediterranean power, the Byzantines. Therefore, it made sense for the Fatimids to develop a strong naval presence. To this end, the powerful Bulgarian Emperor Simeon I proposed a joint attack on Constantinople in the 920s, consisting of a Bulgarian land attack and a Fatimid naval attack. In the end, the matter was handled through Byzantine Fatimid diplomacy, a recurrent theme throughout the entire chronology of their relationship. Al-Mahdi even built his new fortified capital by the coast, aptly naming it after himself, Mahdiya. The Great Mosque of Mahdiya, built during his reign, still stands today. By the end of his reign in 934 AD, Al-Mahdi's realm stretched from Morocco in the west to Libya in the east. In the 910s, he had even tried to invade Egypt twice. Both times they were unsuccessful and beaten back. Despite these fruitless expeditions, the Fatimids still dreamt of taking over Egypt one day. Under al-Mahdi's son and successor, Al-Qaim, the Fatimid navy demonstrated its strength by going as far as northern Italy and sacking the city of Genoa in 935. But the end of his reign was marked by a Berber revolt spearheaded by Abu Yazid, a Berber from the Ibadi sect. By 945, the rebels were outside the walls of Mahdiya, laying siege to the Fatimid capital. For a brief moment, it seemed like the Fatimids were on their deathbed, but supplies from Sicily and Tripoli sustained them in their darkest moments. The suppression of the revolt would be left to the third Caliph, al-Mansur, whose name appropriately meant the victorious, because by 948, the Fatimids reigned supreme over their territories once again, including Sicily, which was also in revolt during the mid-940s. This success was commemorated by the construction of a brand new capital at Mansuriyya, named after the Caliph. Al-Mansur's reign was a short one, dying in 953 after a long illness. he would be succeeded by his son Al-Mu'izz, the man who would legitimize the Fatimids as a great power. Initially, the new Caliph had his own issues to worry about. Chief amongst them were the restless Berbers in the Maghreb. This is where we get introduced to a key figure in Fatimid history, Jawhar, a freed man whose ethnic background has variously been described as Sicilian, Slavic, and Byzantine. Al-Mu'izz's legacy would become intertwined with that of Jawhar. In 958, the Caliph chose Jawhar to bring the Maghreb back under the writ of the Fatimids. Within 3 years, he had defeated antagonistic Berber tribes and restricted the Umayyads of Cordoba to the cities of Tangiers and Ceuta. To prove he had actually reached the Atlantic Ocean, Jawhar sent fish kept alive in salt water back to the Caliph at Mansuriyah. But Jawhar's, and by extension Al-Mu'izz's crowning achievement would come at the end of the 960s. Egypt had been a prized possession for regional powers since the birth of empires. And it's not tough to see why either. Geographically, it is strategically located and it has the benefit of exploiting the fertile land on the banks of the world's longest river, the Nile. Throughout history, Egypt's fate has been interlinked with the Nile. So it was that in the 960s, the Nile floods were extremely low. These natural cycles were absolutely central to the well-being of Egyptian society. In addition, the rulers of Egypt, the Ikhshidids, were racked by political intrigue amongst its elites. And the Abbasids at this time were a mere shadow of their former selves, kept in check by the Buyids. And so, the Fatimids under Jawhar moved into Egypt in 969, completing the takeover without much fighting. As well as the overwhelming force the Fatimids had on their side, a big reason for the lack of fighting was the Aman, or guarantee of safety offered by the Fatimid Caliph to the people of Fustat, the Egyptian capital, and more broadly, Egypt. In the Fatimid Aman, the people of Egypt submitted to the authority of the Fatimid Caliph, and in return, the Caliph would stabilize the currency and restore safe passage on pilgrimage routes to the holy cities. Perhaps most tellingly, Sunni Muslims, the majority in Egypt, would not have their way of lives harmed in any way, shape or form by their new Shia rulers. Jawhar would spend 4 years in Egypt as a viceroy for the Caliph, who was preparing his affairs in order to move the capital of his empire from Ifriqiya to Egypt. There, Jawhar had started on the construction of a city that would come to be known as Al-Qahira Al-Mu'izziyya, or the victorious city of Al-Mu'izz, which we know as Cairo. It was also in this time that the initial steps were taken for the construction of the world-famous Al-Azhar University. In these developmental times, Jawhar had to defeat an invasion of Fatimid Egypt by the Qarmatians, another Ismaili sect that grew out of the Ismaili Dawah network. In 973, Al-Mu'izz arrived in Cairo, but would only get to enjoy his new environment for a few years before he died in 975. The move of the Fatimids from the Maghreb to Egypt would also determine the imperial focus of the Khilafah. The Maghreb was entrusted to the Zirid dynasty. Consequently, Sicily and the Maghrebi dominions would gradually gain more and more autonomy. Nevertheless, proximity to the Middle East allowed the Fatimids to rapidly take control of Palestine and southern Syria. They even replaced the Abbasids as the protectors of the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, This was considered a major propaganda victory. Speaking of propaganda, an essential element of the Fatimids' ability to expand into new territories was their dawah network. Each year, the da'is in different parts of the world would send messengers with reports and charity collected. This network extended as far as Multan in modern-day Pakistan. The city actually came under the Fatimid Caliph's suzerainty as well. It was also this network which proved essential when the Fatimids moved into Egypt, since their missionaries had gained intimate knowledge of the country's affairs. In 975, Al-Aziz became the first Fatimid to begin his reign from Egypt. For the most part, his reign can be considered the high point of the Fatimids. Domestically, Al-Aziz set about to reinvigorate the Egyptian economy, stabilize the currency, and increase tax revenue. The new Caliph had also made administrative changes to governance. In 979, the office of Vizier was established. The first Vizier was Yaqub ibn Kilis, an Iraqi Jew who had converted to Islam later in life. It was also under his stewardship that the Egyptian economy recovered. Considering a former Jew could rise to the second highest office in the land, sheds light onto the Fatimids' policy towards non-Muslims and ethnic minorities. Such an open attitude was especially necessary after the move to Egypt, where there was a large Coptic Christian population that predated the arrival of Islam. Key Christians in the reign of Al-Aziz include the Coptic Vizier Isa ibn Nasturus and the Caliph's Melkite Christian concubine. This openness was extended to other Ahl al-Kitab, or people of the book, like the Jews, as we've already seen. Other key Jews include Manasha ibn Ibrahim, who was the financial controller of Fatimid Syria. This religious openness had the dual purpose of placating the diverse nature of the societies they ruled, and it also contributed to the socio-economic and political spheres of Fatimid governance. Al-Aziz extended this multi-ethnic outlook onto his army as well. Towards the late 970s, he reformed the military in a way which would play a key role in the next 2 centuries of Fatimid history. When the Caliph's armies were defeated on numerous occasions in Syria, Al-Aziz realized he had inherited an army which was not optimized to fight in this region. In order to accommodate, he adopted the Ghilman system of slave soldiers that consisted mainly of Turks. The Abbasids had used the very same system, but considering the esteemed position the Kutama Berbers held in the Fatimid state, this did not go down well with them. What this did was essentially create 2 camps, the Maghariba, or the Westerners, consisting of Berbers, and the Mashariqa, or Easterners, consisting of Turks. So although Fatimid military performance fared better in Syria, the new reforms placed a significant strain at the heart of Fatimid governance, which would wreak havoc in the years to come. In terms of foreign policy, Al-Aziz's main preoccupation was Syria. At that time, it was a contested arena between the Byzantines, Fatimids, and the Hamdanids. Southern and central Syria came under the firm control of Al-Aziz. He even planned a major campaign to bring northern Syria under his control, but died before getting there in 996. He was succeeded by his 11-year-old son, Al-Hakim. As is often the case throughout the history of the Islamic world, anytime a child king comes to the throne, the royal court is thrown in political intrigue by administrators and courtiers who scramble to take advantage of an underage ruler. this was no different. In fact, this issue was made even more detrimental by the ethnic rivalries amongst the army and administration that were a result of Al-Aziz's military reforms. The Berber-Turkic rivalry even boiled over to open warfare at times. In 1000 AD, the young Caliph assassinated his vizier and took the reins of government. It was clear that Al-Hakim wanted to have a greater say in running the state in a way where he was not so encumbered by his administration. Unfortunately for his officials, this meant a removal of the old guard who formed the backbone of Fatimid administration, many of whom were executed. During his reign, Al-Hakim was able to complete the Fatimid takeover of Syria, but this brought the Fatimids in even greater proximity with their Abbasid foes. Partly in response to the fears of Fatimid encroachment, in 1011, the Abbasid Caliph Al-Qadir sponsored the production of the Baghdad Manifesto, a written document which stated that the Fatimids were not descended from the Prophet's daughter, Fatima. Al-Hakim was a fascinating figure, and historical sources are sharply divided on their judgment of him. There are those who consider him a mad tyrant who was mentally unstable. Then there are others who feel he was a misunderstood ruler with a genuine interest in learning and the welfare of his people. To be honest, there is evidence that points to both viewpoints ringing true. Having said that, his reign was certainly a departure of the tolerance provided by his predecessors to the Jews and Christians. Certain Christian festivals were banned during his reign. In 1009, Al-Hakim ordered the destruction of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, a holy Christian site in Jerusalem. He even extended his intolerance to the Muslim citizens as well. In 1004, he instated a Shia practice which curses the first three Rashidun Caliphs, thereby alienating his majority Sunni populace. But within a few years, he abolished and even punished this practice. There is also the controversy surrounding him and the Druze faith, which hold him as a key figure of their creed. At the same time, Al-Hakim exhibited traits of an enlightened ruler. In 1005, he opened the Dar al-Ilm, the House of Knowledge, a library where theological and scientific study was carried out. He completed great works of architecture such as the Al-Hakim Mosque, which still stands today. In the early years of his reign, there are stories that claim the Caliph would go out of his palace and mingle with the ordinary people in the souks and bazaars, listening to their complaints. As bizarre as his reign was, the way it ended was even stranger. Al-Hakim was fond of going on nightly excursions into the hills outside Cairo. But on one such night in 1021 AD, he went out but never returned. All that was found was his donkey and a blood-stained shirt. The period following the mysterious disappearance of Al-Hakim in 1021 saw a downward trajectory of the Fatimid state's prestige and power. In this regard, one thing that immediately became obvious after 1021 was the rapid and dramatic decline of the Caliph's personal authority. In conjunction with a few other factors, this led the Fatimid state to experience incredible turbulence from within. Out of the last 8 Caliphs that they had from 1021 until the end of the dynasty in 1171, 6 of them ascended while still minors. As a result, the door was opened for other actors to fill the vacuum of authority left in the absence of a strong leader. Prior to his death, Al-Hakim had nominated his nephew Abdul Rahman ibn Ilyas as his successor. But Al-Hakim's sister, Sitt al-Mulk, was a powerful presence in the Fatimid government and engineered the succession so that Al-Hakim's son, Al-Zahir, could come to power. Until her death in 1023, imperial authority was largely wielded by Sitt al-Mulk. After her death, the person with the most power at the royal court became Al-Jarjarai. A man who once fell victim to Al-Hakim's displeasure and had both of his hands cut off, Al-Jarjarai would remain the vizier for the next 2 decades. In 1036, the trend of minor caliphs ascending the throne was continued by Al-Zahir's 7-year-old son and successor, Al-Mustansir. Even when the Khalif came of age, power was not necessarily in his hands. After Al-Jarjarai's death in 1045, the Khalif's mother, Rasad, played a domineering role in dictating Khalifal authority. A key consequence of her involvement in state affairs was the intensification of ethnic tensions within the army. Divisions within the Fatimid army could be traced back to Al-Aziz's reign, when the Masharika and Maghariba, represented by the Berbers and Turks respectively, clashed. Even though these 2 ethnic groups were the largest contingents, the Khilafa's army was a multi-ethnic force comprising of Byzantine Greeks, Daylamites from northern Persia, and black African soldiers who, despite having a variety of ethnic backgrounds, were grouped together. Rasad, the Khalif's mother, was originally of sub-Saharan African origin, being described as Nubian or Sudanese. Under her patronage, black Africans were favoured and raised to important positions, much to the annoyance of the Turks and Berbers. These tensions were exacerbated by the fact that by the 1060s, Egypt's fiscal administration had broken down, and therefore the Khalif and his viziers sometimes found it difficult to pay their soldiers. This in turn led to the soldiers becoming more aggressive in their demands for restitution. A similar set of circumstances had befallen the Abbasids in the 9th and 10th centuries. It was not uncommon for Fatimid soldiers to take matters into their own hands and try to plunder wealth from ordinary, defenseless citizens throughout the Nile Valley and Delta. In 1062 and 1067, tensions spilled over into open battles between the black Africans and the Turks. With the Turks emerging victorious, they could pretty much make any demand of the Khalif. In the process, they resorted to looting the imperial treasury. Such a breakdown of law and order at the government level as well as at the local level brought the Khilafah to its knees. The general state of insecurity affected the cultivation of land across Egypt, but perhaps even more menacingly, geological issues surrounding the river Nile became obvious. The Nile has been considered the lifeline of Egypt, and for good reason. In the past, when its waters rose sufficiently, it helped Egypt become known as the breadbasket of the Roman Empire. The entire country's economy was intimately tied to the Nile, meaning that when droughts hit, the results were disastrous. And so in the 1060s, the compounding effects of low waters from the Nile and poor land cultivation resulted in a famine. Cairo, the center of government, was reliant upon the countryside for food supply. But since the countryside was ruled by Nasir al-Dawla, a leader of the Turkic soldiers who was antagonistic to the Khalif, the capital was the worst affected by the famine. Tales of ridiculously high prices, every type of animal being eaten, and eventually even cannibalism can be found in the chronicles of the time. It is said that Khalif al-Mustansir was able to feed himself only with the generous charity of his citizens. To make matters worse, in 1070, Nasir al-Dawla, from his seat in Alexandria, switched his allegiance to the Abbasids and requested troops from the Seljuk Sultan Alp Arslan. The Fatimid state was now literally on the verge of destruction. Nonetheless, nothing really materialized from this plan, since Sultan Alp Arslan had to deal with a Byzantine force that was moving into eastern Anatolia, a set of circumstances that resulted in the pivotal Seljuk victory at Manzikert in 1071. In late 1073, in a rare show of his Khaliphal authority, Al-Mustansir took the initiative to call upon Badr al-Jamali, an Armenian Fatimid general who was contending with the troublesome Seljuk-affiliated Turkoman nomads in Syria. Badr had a disciplined force, largely comprised of fellow Armenians that were loyal to him. Therefore, he was well situated to bring an end to the chaos and anarchy which afflicted Egypt at the time. In some senses, Badr evoked the image of Jawhar 100 years prior, bringing peace and stability to Fatimid Egypt through his sheer hard work and determination. By 1076, Badr had conquered the entire country in the name of the Fatimids once again. In the process, he instituted the rule of the Viziers of the Sword, in which a series of military strongman viziers assumed executive authority over the realm. In addition to being in crisis at home in Egypt, the Fatimids were facing challenges to their authority abroad as well. The most problematic piece of territory they held was Syria. The Fatimids, like each of its rulers since the 9th century, never really managed to govern Syria with peace of mind. Even though al-Hakim had gone as far as installing a Fatimid governor for the northern city of Aleppo, Bilad al-Sham, as it's known in Arabic, was a battle zone for a variety of competing groups. This included the three great imperial powers of the region, the Fatimids, the Byzantines, and the Abbasids. But prior to the arrival of the Turks in the 1060s, Syria was at the mercy of Arab tribes such as the Banu Kilab. Coalitions of Bedouin tribes became formidable foes to the larger imperial powers. They even went on to establish their own states, like the Mirdasids of northern Syria. Despite this, the Fatimids were able to secure control over Syria in the 1030s thanks to the efforts of the energetic general Anushtagin al-Dizbari. An ethnic Turk, he was born in Transoxiana and entered Fatimid service through the Ghilman system of slave soldiers. Thanks to his military exploits, he was able to take Aleppo from the Mirdasids and even force vassalage on the Numayrid Arabs of the Jazira or Upper Mesopotamia. But Anushtagin fell prey to the chaos of the court in Cairo when he ran afoul of the vizier al-Jarjarai and was accused of treason. In the end, he was only spared of a violent punishment by his ailing health that led him to dying of natural causes in 1042. And with his death, Aleppo slipped out of the Fatimids' control. Anushtaghin's successor in Syria, the aforementioned Nasir al-Dawla, was unable to replicate his predecessor's success. The new governor found it difficult to enforce Fatimid authority over Syria, especially the northern territory around Aleppo. In the midst of this downward trajectory of Fatimid power, they accomplished what can be argued to be one of their most impressive achievements, at least on paper. In Iraq, a disaffected Turkic officer, al-Basari, in conjunction with the propaganda activities carried out by Ismaili Da'is, resulted in Fatimid sovereignty being accepted throughout the major cities. In 1057, Mosul submitted, and the following year, the capital of their Abbasid rivals, Baghdad, followed when the khutbah was read out in the name of the Fatimid Caliph. But the sovereignty of the Fatimids was only recognized in Iraq for a year, because a new and dynamic force had emerged as a key player in the Middle East, the Seljuk Turks. In 1059, the Seljuk Sultan Tughril forced the Fatimids out of Baghdad and restored the Abbasids to their ancestral capital. This move precipitated Seljuk aggression in Syria and Palestine during the 1060s and 70s. By 1070, Aleppo and northern Syria fell under Seljuk authority. Almost a decade later, in 1079, Damascus and the southern half of Syria also fell to the Turks when the Seljuk Sultan Malik Shah sent his ambitious brother Tutush to bring it under the Seljuk fold. In Palestine, the Fatimids could only hold on to Ascalon and a few coastal towns such as Tyre, Sidon, and Acre, all of which were permanently lost to the incoming Crusaders at the beginning of the 12th century. The Seljuks even forced the khutbah in Mecca to be read in the name of the Abbasid Caliph once again from 1088 onwards. These setbacks, however, did not dishearten the Fatimids from trying to persistently get involved in the Levant's affairs. But these brave attempts at political relevancy were often temporary. For example, despite taking over Jerusalem from the Seljuks in 1098, they only managed to hold on to it for a year before the Crusaders dislodged them at the culmination of the First Crusade. With so much focus on Egypt and the Levant, one is almost tempted to forget that the Fatimid state originated further west in Ifriqiya. When Al-Muizz moved his government and capital to Cairo, the entire focus of the Khilafah shifted eastwardly. The Maghreb was left to the Zirid Berber dynasty, which had been involved in the Fatimid state since its early days. Whilst the move to Cairo helped the Fatimids expand into the Middle East, it also facilitated their original power base in the Maghreb to slip away. Although this process was gradual and in some ways natural, in 1048 the Zirids formally declared their independence from the Fatimids when they renounced the Shia creed and read the khutbah in the name of the Sunni Abbasid Caliph. What followed next is an understudied yet crucial event in the history of the Maghreb. As we've already touched upon, the Fatimid central state was experiencing turbulence in this period. Therefore, they did not have the military capability to send an expedition out west. Instead, what they decided to do was send Arab Bedouin tribes like the Banu Hilal to punish their former allies. The invasion of the Bedouin tribes brought chaos and destruction to Ifriqiya, so much so that the Zirids never really recovered from its shock. The great city of Kairouan was sacked and never regained its former splendor. The Fatimids celebrated this success, especially since it forced the Zirid ruler to briefly pledge his allegiance back to the Caliph in Cairo. But the fact still remained: Fatimid authority in Ifriqiya and beyond no longer held any real weight. Further north, in Sicily, the Fatimids were represented by the Kalbids, who, like the Zirids, were involved in the Fatimid state from its early days. The Kalbids in Sicily still bore the name of the Caliph on their coins even during the reign of Al-Mustansir, but in practice, Cairo no longer had any power over Sicily, and even seems to have lost interest in it. The Kalbid downfall in 1053 brought whatever control the Fatimids had left over the Mediterranean island to an end. When the Normans were conquering Sicily from 1061 to 1091, Cairo did next to nothing to prevent it from happening. After all, they did have their own internal issues to worry about. In the backdrop of Fatimid authority diminishing abroad, Yemen stood alone as a unique example where loyalty to Cairo remained fairly strong until the end. The Sulayhid dynasty controlled much of Yemen for about 100 years until the 1130s. This dynasty included the remarkable ruler Queen Arwa al-Sulayhi, who ruled for more than 50 years. After her death in 1138, the dominant power in Yemen became the Zurayhids, who stayed loyal to the Fatimids. Both the Sulayhid and Zurayhid dynasties grew out of the Fatimid-sponsored Ismaili Dawah program. The reign of al-Mustansir saw the peak of the Fatimid Dawah, and its da'is were active from India to Khorasan and from Iraq to Transoxiana. Al-Mustansir's 58-year reign came to an end in 1094. His death led to confusion over the issue of succession. In the same year, Badr al-Jamali had died and was replaced as vizier by his son al-Afdal, who wanted al-Mustansir's younger son, al-Musta'ali, to become Khalif. But the deceased ruler's eldest son, Nizar, claimed that his father had designated him as successor. Nizar was eventually killed in the ensuing conflict. This succession crisis led to one of the most fascinating episodes in medieval history. To tell us more, we go to my collab partner, Let's Talk Religion.
A man named Hassan as-Sabbah agreed with Nizar's claim to the Caliphate and by extension the role of Imam for the Ismailis. Hassan had studied in Cairo but lived in Persia and served as an important da'i or missionary in that region. In 1090 he established himself and his followers in Alamut, a fortress in the El-Burs mountain range in northern Persia. This strand of Ismailis became known as the Nizaris as opposed to the Musta'lis who supported the Fatimid Caliph al-Musta'li as the Imam. From his fortress at Alamut, Hassan and his supporters fought against the Seljuks, mainly relying on assassination as a military technique due to their small numbers. Legends arose that the assassins, called Fida'is, were drugged with hashish. Now there's little evidence to support this legend, but the term hashashin became a widespread nickname for these agents, and the English word assassin actually derives from it. A number of high-profile assassinations have been attributed to the group, including the famous Seljuk vizier Nizam al-Mulk in 1092, the Fatimid vizier al-Afdal in 1121, and the Fatimid Caliph al-Ammar in 1130.
Thanks for that, Philip. After you're done with this video, make sure you guys check out his video on the Bohras and Sulaymani Ismailis who grew out of the Fatimid Dawah. The introduction of the Crusaders in the Middle East offered the Fatimids an opportunity to escape their seemingly permanent decline. Despite initially trying to arrange an alliance with the Crusaders, the Fatimids could have used their status as a Khilafah to lead the charge against the Christians. But the previous 7 decades of problems and issues had taken its toll. The Fatimids were a shell of their former selves. In the first 2 decades of the 12th century, the Crusaders had stripped the Fatimids of all of its Levantine coastal territories. In 1117, the Kingdom of Jerusalem even launched what would become a failed invasion of Egypt. When the domineering vizier al-Afdal was assassinated in 1121, the incumbent Khalif al-Amir was finally able to wield a degree of authority. 4 years later, he got rid of al-Afdal's successor and ruled without a vizier for the rest of his reign, marking the first time since al-Hakim a century earlier that the office of Khalif could reclaim absolute authority. Al-Amir was unable to enjoy the fruits of his newfound importance. In 1130, he was assassinated by Nizari assassins. His death led to yet another schism within Shia Ismailism, and consequently another succession crisis. Al-Amir left his only son, the 6-month-old Al-Tayyib, to succeed him. Soon enough, Al-Amir's cousin, Abd al-Majid, established himself as the regent to the infant ruler, who subsequently mysteriously disappeared. A few weeks later, Qutaifat, a son of the deceased vizier Al-Afdal, led a military uprising and took the office of vizier. Qutaifat's rule was remarkable, not least of all because he proclaimed that the Fatimid Khilafah had been abolished, and he looked to distance himself from Ismailism. But a year later, in December 1131, Qutaifat was assassinated by Fatimid loyalists, and Abd al-Majid was freed after having been imprisoned for the previous 13 months. Abd al-Majid then took the regnal name of Al-Hafiz and proclaimed himself as Khalif and Imam in early 1132, thus breaking the 10-generation-long tradition of father-to-son successions. His accession further divided the Ismaili community between the Hafizi, those who accepted Al-Hafiz's right to rule, and the Tayyibis, those who accepted the infant Al-Tayyib's right to rule. The rest of Al-Hafiz's reign was similarly marred by chronic instability. Whilst things were fairly quiet on the external front, Egypt itself was wrecked with uprisings and power struggles. These issues were made worse by problems with the Nile floods throughout the 1140s. Despite the litany of issues he faced, Al-Hafiz managed to regain some Khalifal sovereignty back, choosing to rule without a vizier for the last 10 years of his reign. This situation changed dramatically after his death in 1149. From that point on, it can be said that Fatimid Khalifs stopped exercising royal authority. Instead, power was solely concentrated in the hands of competing viziers whose feuds laid bare the weakened foundations of the Fatimid state. The viziers even felt confident enough to murder the Khalif, as was the case with Al-Hafiz's successor, Al-Zafir, in 1154. As is often the case in history, the collapse of a former great state opens the door for neighbouring powers to take advantage. With the Fatimids on their way to completely disintegrating, the 1160s saw both Amalric I of the Crusader Kingdom of Jerusalem and the ruler of Syria, Nur al-Din Zengi, try to incorporate Egypt into their respective realms. When the Fatimid vizier Shawar requested aid from Nur al-Din, the Zengid ruler sent his Kurdish general Shirkuh to Egypt. Shirkuh was accompanied by his young nephew Salahuddin Ayyubi, or as he's known in the West, Saladin. In 1169, Shirkuh succeeded in becoming the vizier to the Khalif in Cairo, but he died a few months later, leaving his nephew Salahuddin as the next vizier. For the next 2 years, Salahuddin strengthened his base in Egypt. Finally, in 1171, the last Fatimid Khalif, Al-Adid, died, with some suspecting Salahuddin of having poisoned him. Salahuddin then recognized the authority of the Abbasid Khalif in Baghdad, thereby formally abolishing what little was left of the Fatimid Khilafah. In the 250 years or so that the Fatimid Khilafah existed, it proved itself to be a fascinating state that is well worth studying by students of the past. More so than anything, it had an eclectic identity that merged various elements together to form a unique character. The Fatimids had Arab roots. Its early support base depended upon the Kutama Berbers, It ended up employing large numbers of Turks and sub-Saharan Africans within its army. It also had numerous viziers with Jewish and Christian origins. Not to forget the generations of Armenian viziers it had. And whilst the majority of its citizenry were Sunnis, it was the only Shia Khilafah in history. As usual, I want to thank my patrons for their generous support. If you want to support the channel, there's a link to my Patreon in the description to this video. Make sure you guys check out Let's Talk Religion's video on the Bohras and Sulaimani Ismailis who grew out of the Fatimid Dawah. Until next time, peace.